Hey everyone, welcome back to another strange journey through the weirdest corners of dream history. Tonight we're diving into something that'll probably make you question everything you thought you knew about taking kids. Seriously, children whose dreams literally changed the course of adult decisions and in some cases, entire empires. So before you settle in with your favorite pillow, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. But honestly, only if you actually enjoy these bizarre historical rabbit holes I drag you down. And I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see our global community of insomniacs and dream enthusiasts checking in. Now, dim those lights, get cozy, and prepare to discover how the pure, unfiltered visions of youth have shaped history in ways that would make most adults feel pretty stupid about dismissing kids' silly dreams. And hey, if you end up drifting off somewhere in the middle of this, that's exactly what we're going for here. You know what's wild? We spend so much time telling kids that their dreams aren't real, that they should grow up and stop believing in impossible things. But tonight, we're talking about children whose dreams were so powerful, so specific that they convinced emperors, generals, and billionaires to completely change their plans. Because sometimes, apparently, the clearest vision of the future comes from minds that haven't learned yet what's supposed to be impossible. Dreams don't just happen to you, they happen through you. And sometimes they happen through the most unexpected messengers. Anyway, let's start with what might be the most expensive dream a child ever had, involving a Roman emperor and a decision that literally changed the face of Christianity forever. Picture this, it's 312 AD in Rome, and the most powerful man in the world is about to make a decision that will change the course of human history. But before he does, he's going to listen to his 7-year-old son describe a dream about a glowing cross in the sky. Because nothing says solid military strategy, quite like taking battle advice from a kid who still needs help tying his sandals. Emperor Constantine the Great, and yes, he really did call himself the Great, because humility wasn't exactly a Roman virtue back then, was preparing for what would become known as the Battle of Milvian Bridge. This wasn't just any battle. This was the fight that would determine who controlled the entire Roman Empire. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Lose and Constantine would be dead by sunset, probably with his head on a spike as a warning to future ambitious generals. Win, and he'd rule the known world, commanding legions that stretched from Britain to the deserts of Africa. Constantine had been fighting this civil war for years, battling against his rival Maxentus for control of the western half of the empire. It was brutal, expensive, and exhausting, the kind of prolonged conflict that destroys economies and turns entire provinces into wastelands. But now, finally, Constantine had cornered Maxentus in Rome itself. One decisive battle would settle everything. The Roman army was camped outside the city, and you can imagine the tension. Soldiers sharpening their swords, generals studying maps by flickering torchlight, everyone knowing that tomorrow would either make them rich and famous or dead and forgotten. It was the kind of night where men write letters to their wives that they hope will never be delivered. And pray to gods they're not sure are listening. Constantine himself was probably not sleeping well. He was a practical man, a career soldier who'd spent most of his adult life fighting on the frontiers of the empire. He wasn't exactly known for his religious devotion. He was a typical Roman general, pragmatic and ruthless, willing to worship whichever god seemed most likely to help him win battles. The Roman pantheon was basically a divine insurance policy. Honor all the gods, and hopefully at least one of them will have your back when things get messy. But that night, something happened that would change not just Constantine's life, but the entire trajectory of Western civilization. His 7-year-old son Crispus came running into his tent, wide-eyed and babbling about the most vivid dream he'd ever had. And here's where the story gets really interesting, because this wasn't just any 7-year-old, this was the son of the future emperor, being raised in a military camp, surrounded by soldiers and political intrigue. Crispus had been born into a world of constant warfare and political maneuvering. His earliest memories were probably of sword clashes and military horns, of adults speaking in hushed tones about battles and betrayals. This was a kid who'd been taught from birth that the world was a dangerous place where only the strong survived. He wasn't some sheltered palace child dreaming about fairy tales. He was a military brat who understood that his father's success or failure would determine whether he lived to see his 8th birthday. So when Crispus burst into his father's tent that night, trembling with excitement and fear, Constantine probably expected to hear about nightmares involving enemy soldiers or battlefield horrors. Instead, his son started describing something completely different, a vision that was simultaneously terrifying and beautiful, violent and peaceful, ancient and revolutionary. In little Crispus's dream, he was standing on a hill overlooking their army camp, but everything looked different. The sky was darker than usual, filled with roiling clouds that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The air itself seemed to hum with energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. And then, slowly, majestically, impossibly, a massive cross began to appear in the sky above their army. But this wasn't just any cross. And remember, the cross wasn't yet a widely recognized Christian symbol. To most Romans, crucifixion was just a particularly unpleasant way to execute criminals and rebels. For a 7-year-old to dream about a cross as a symbol of divine power was unusual, to say the least. The cross in Crispus's dream was blazing with fire that didn't burn, suspended in the air like some kind of divine billboard. It was made of light that seemed to come from within rather than reflecting from any external source. The boy described it as brighter than the sun, but it didn't hurt to look at it. It made you want to look at it more. The cross seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that felt almost alive. And below the cross, written in letters that seemed to glow with their own light, were words that would become some of the most famous in Christian history. In hoc signo vinces, in this sign, conquer. But here's the really wild part. Crispus didn't speak Latin perfectly yet. He was still learning the language, still making the kind of grammar mistakes that 7-year-olds make. But when he described the words he'd seen in his dream, he pronounced them perfectly, with the kind of precise inflection that would have impressed his Latin tutors. The boy told his father that in the dream, he somehow knew, with the absolute certainty that only children seem to possess, that this symbol meant their army would win the battle. But not just win, they would win decisively, overwhelmingly, in a way that would end the civil war forever. And all of this would happen only if Constantine's soldiers fought under the sign of the cross. Now, here's where the story gets even more interesting. Constantine's first reaction was probably what any parents would be. That's nice, son. Now go back to bed. Daddy has an empire to conquer in the morning, but Crispus wouldn't be dismissed. He kept insisting that the dream was different from his usual nighttime fantasies. He said it felt more real than being awake, and that he could still see the cross when he closed his eyes. The boy's urgency and conviction started to unnerve Constantine. Crispus wasn't prone to dramatic episodes or attention-seeking behavior. He was generally a practical, level-headed child who understood the seriousness of their situation. For him to be so insistent about a dream was ... unusual, but then something even stranger happened. That same night, after Crispus had finally been convinced to go back to bed, Constantine himself had a dream. And in his dream, he saw the exact same cross his son had described, the same blazing light, the same pulsing rhythm, the same impossible beauty. He heard the same words, in hoc signo vinces, spoken in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But Constantine's dream included additional elements that Crispus hadn't mentioned. He saw the cross not just as a symbol of victory, but as a symbol of transformation. In his vision, the cross represented not just military triumph, but a fundamental change in how the Roman Empire would operate. He saw himself not just as a conqueror, but as a protector of the oppressed, a champion of the persecuted. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. A superstitious man living in a superstitious time, Constantine knew that when your 7-year-old son has a prophetic dream that matches your own vision exactly, well, that's the kind of sign that even the most pragmatic Roman general can't dismiss. But here's what made Constantine's decision even more remarkable. He wasn't just gambling with his own life. He was commanding an army of seasoned Roman legions, men who'd been fighting under the traditional Roman standards for their entire careers. These were soldiers who'd sworn oaths to Jupiter and Mars, who'd carried the golden eagles of Rome into battle across 3 continents. and now their commander was about to ask them to fight under the symbol of what most Romans still considered a weird Jewish cult. The Roman legions weren't exactly known for their religious flexibility. These were professional soldiers who took their traditions seriously. They'd been conquering the world under the protection of the traditional Roman gods for centuries. The idea of suddenly switching to a different deity, especially one associated with pacifism and turning the other cheek, would have seemed not just strange, but potentially suicidal. But Constantine was a natural leader, and he understood how to present radical ideas in ways that his men could accept. Instead of framing the cross as a Christian symbol, he presented it as a new military standard revealed through divine prophecy. He didn't ask his soldiers to convert to Christianity, he asked them to fight under a symbol that had been revealed to him and his son in miraculous dreams. The morning of the battle, Constantine made what was probably the most expensive decision in military history based on a child's dream. He ordered his entire army to paint the Christian symbol, the Chi, a combination of the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek, on their shields and standards. Thousands of soldiers suddenly found themselves fighting under the banner of a religion most of them had never really understood. All because a 7-year-old had a vivid dream about a glowing cross. The logistics of this decision were staggering. Imagine trying to organize thousands of soldiers to repaint their equipment in a single morning before a major battle. The quartermasters probably thought their commander had lost his mind. But Constantine's orders were clear and urgent. Every shield, every standard, every piece of military equipment had to bear the Chi symbol before the battle began. The soldiers' reactions were probably mixed. Some might have been excited by the novelty, others worried about abandoning the gods who brought them victory in previous battles. But Roman legions were disciplined. When their commander gave an order, they followed it, regardless of their personal opinions. The Battle of Milvian Bridge was fought on October 28, 312 AD, and it was a complete and decisive victory for Constantine. His forces crushed Maxentus's army so thoroughly that it basically ended the Roman civil war in a single afternoon. Maxentus himself drowned in the Tiber River while trying to flee, and Constantine entered Rome as the undisputed ruler of the Western Empire. But here's what made the victory even more remarkable. Constantine's soldiers reported that during the battle, they felt an unusual sense of confidence and unity. Many claimed to have seen the cross symbol glowing above their formations, just as Crispus had described in his dream. Whether this was mass hallucination, divine intervention, or just the psychological effect of fighting under a symbol their commander believed in, the result was the same, a crushing victory that transformed the Roman Empire forever. Constantine, being a man who kept his promises to mysterious dream visions, immediately began implementing policies that would legalize and eventually promote Christianity throughout the empire. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD granted religious tolerance to Christians, ending centuries of persecution. But this was just the beginning. Constantine would eventually convert to Christianity himself, establishing it as the preferred religion of the Roman state, the really wild part. Young Crispus later said he remembered every detail of that prophetic dream for the rest of his life. He could describe the exact shade of golden light that emanated from the cross, the way the words seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, even the feeling of absolute certainty that washed over him when he realized what the vision meant. Most kids forget their dreams by breakfast, but this one stuck with him like it was burned into his memory with divine fire. Crispus grew up to become one of Constantine's most trusted generals, and he always credited that childhood dream with shaping his understanding of leadership and divine purpose. He would later say that the dream taught him that sometimes the most important messages come not through logic or experience, but through pure, unfiltered revelation that bypasses all our adult skepticism and doubt. Of course, this being Roman history, the story has a dark and tragic ending. Constantine eventually had Crispus executed in 326 AD, possibly over a conspiracy involving Constantine's second wife Fausta, who may have falsely accused Crispus of treason or attempted seduction. The exact details are murky. Roman palace intrigue was always complicated and usually fatal. But by then, the damage was done. Christianity had already spread throughout the empire, becoming the dominant religion of the Western world. The transformation that began with the 7-year-old's dream about a glowing cross had fundamentally altered the course of human civilization. Churches were being built where temples to Jupiter had once stood. Christian bishops were advising emperors who had once thrown Christians to lions. The entire social and spiritual landscape of Europe was being reshaped by the consequences of that single night's vision. Think about the historical implications for a moment. If Constantine had dismissed his son's dream as childish fantasy, if he'd fought the Battle of Milvian Bridge under traditional Roman standards, the entire development of Western civilization might have been different. Christianity might have remained a minority religion, never achieving the political power that would shape European culture for the next 1,000 years. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the entire Christian tradition of art, philosophy, and social organization might never have developed. All because a 7-year-old boy had a dream that convinced his father to gamble everything on a symbol he'd never really believed in before. It's one of those historical moments that demonstrates how the most monumental changes in human history sometimes hinge on the most unlikely and unpredictable factors. The story of Constantine and Crispus reminds us that throughout history, some of the most important decisions have been made not by committees of experts or careful strategic analysis, but by individuals who were willing to take seriously the visions and insights of those who see the world with fresh eyes. Sometimes the clearest view of the future comes from minds that haven't yet learned what's supposed to be impossible. Dreams don't just happen to you, they happen through you. And sometimes they happen through the most unexpected messengers, changing the world in ways that even their dreamers couldn't have imagined. Now let's jump forward a few centuries to Renaissance Florence, where a 10-year-old boy's recurring nightmare about burning books convinced one of the most powerful families in Europe to become the greatest art patrons in human history. And if that sounds like an exaggeration, just wait until you hear what this kid was actually seeing in his dreams. Giovanni de' Medici, not to be confused with the later Pope John the 23rd, because the Medici recycled names like they were going out of style, was just a kid in 1445 when he started having the most disturbing dreams you could imagine. We're talking about nightmares so vivid and terrifying that they would make modern horror movies look like bedtime stories. Every single night he'd wake up screaming about books being thrown into massive bonfires, sculptures being smashed to pieces with sledgehammers, and paintings being torn from walls and burned in public squares while crowds of people cheered like it was some kind of twisted festival. But here's what made these dreams so incredibly specific and historically significant. Giovanni wasn't just seeing generic destruction. He was seeing real books, real artworks, real manuscripts that he'd never encountered in his waking life. This 10-year-old boy would describe in perfect detail illuminated manuscripts from monasteries he'd never visited, sculptures from artists he'd never met, paintings depicting subjects he'd never heard of. His parents, Cosimo and Consina de' Medici, initially thought he was just making things up, the kind of elaborate fantasies that creative kids sometimes invent to get attention. But then they started checking his descriptions against real artworks around Florence, and that's when things got really weird. The kid was somehow dreaming about actual art pieces with photographic accuracy. He'd wake up and immediately start sketching what he'd seen being destroyed, and these sketches matched existing works down to the smallest details: the fold of a saint's robe, the expression on a Madonna's face, the specific arrangement of flowers in a still life. And in every single dream, Giovanni watched these beautiful creations being destroyed by angry mobs, who seemed to believe that art and learning were tools of the devil. He described scenes of religious fanatics throwing precious manuscripts into roaring fires, of skilled craftsmen's life work being smashed to pieces by people who thought beauty itself was somehow sinful. The really disturbing part was how emotionally affected Giovanni was by these dreams. He wasn't just scared, he was heartbroken. He'd wake up sobbing, not from fear, but from what seemed like genuine grief over the loss of beauty and knowledge. This wasn't typical childhood nightmare behavior. Most kids who have bad dreams are frightened of monsters or getting hurt. But Giovanni was mourning the destruction of human creativity, which is a pretty sophisticated emotional response for a 10-year-old. Now, Giovanni's father, Cosimo de' Medici, was already a wealthy banker. The family had built their fortune on innovative banking practices and smart investments. But Cosimo wasn't particularly interested in art or scholarship. He was more focused on the practical aspects of running a business empire and avoiding the various plagues, wars, and political upheavals that made Renaissance Italy such a dangerous place to live. Normal medieval priorities like not getting poisoned by business rivals or having your city conquered by the Pope, but watching his son wake up night after night, crying about the destruction of beauty and knowledge started to get to him. Giovanni would describe his dreams in heartbreaking detail that would make grown adults want to weep. I saw this beautiful book with golden letters being thrown into the fire, and when it burned, it made sounds like it was crying. There were men with torches running through libraries, destroying everything beautiful they could find, and everyone was cheering like it was a celebration. And then all the colors in the world started disappearing one by one until everything was just gray and empty and sad. What 10-year-old comes up with imagery like that? It's like his subconscious was channeling some kind of cosmic horror about the potential destruction of human culture. The specificity of his descriptions was unnerving. He'd talk about the exact sound books made when they burned, the way marble statues cracked when they were struck with hammers, the smell of oil paintings as they were consumed by flames. These weren't the vague, half-remembered fragments that most people retain from dreams. These were detailed, consistent, emotionally devastating experiences that seemed to be traumatizing the boy on a nightly basis. The turning point came when Giovanni described a specific fresco in perfect detail, a work that depicted the life of St. Francis with incredibly intricate background details showing the Tuscan countryside. He described the exact positioning of every tree, the specific shade of blue used for the sky, even the individual flowers painted in the foreground. He talked about how, in his dream, he watched this particular fresco being scraped off the wall by men who claimed it was too worldly and distracted people from proper religious devotion. When Cosimo quietly investigated, because by this point, he was starting to take his son's dream seriously, he found that the fresco existed exactly as Giovanni had described it. It was located in a private chapel that neither Giovanni nor anyone in the family had ever seen. The chapel belonged to a wealthy merchant who had commissioned the work from a relatively unknown artist. And here's the kicker, according to the artist, the fresco was scheduled to be destroyed the following week because the merchant had indeed decided it was too worldly and potentially heretical. The merchant had apparently been influenced by some of the more extreme religious reformers who were gaining popularity in Florence at the time. These reformers preached that elaborate religious art was a form of idolatry that distracted believers from true spiritual devotion. They believed that churches should be plain and simple, that money spent on beautiful art should instead be given to the poor, and that artistic representations of religious figures were essentially forms of worship that violated the commandments against graven images. That's when Cosimo de' Medici made a decision that would change the course of human artistic achievement forever. He decided to start actively collecting and protecting art, books, and scholarly works. Not because he was particularly cultured or intellectual. He probably couldn't tell the difference between a Donatella and a door knocker, but because his young son's dreams had convinced him that human creativity was somehow under existential threat. The decision was both expensive and risky. Collecting art wasn't just about having nice things to look at, it was about making a political and religious statement. By protecting and promoting artistic works, especially those that depicted religious subjects in elaborate or innovative ways, Cosimo was essentially taking a stand against the religious extremists who wanted to eliminate beauty from Christian worship. He was risking being labeled a heretic, which in Renaissance Italy was often a death sentence. But Cosimo was a practical man, and he approached art collecting with the same strategic thinking he used in banking. He began by quietly purchasing artworks that were scheduled for destruction, often paying significantly more than their market value to convince owners to sell rather than destroy them. He established relationships with artists, offering them financial support and protection in exchange for their continued work. He started collecting manuscripts and books, creating what would eventually become one of the most important libraries in Europe. The Medici family became the most famous art patrons in history, supporting artists like Michelangelo, Donatello, and Botticelli. They established libraries, funded scholars, and basically bankrolled the Renaissance. The Medici court became a center of learning and creativity that attracted intellectuals and artists from across Europe. All because a 10-year-old boy kept having nightmares about the destruction of beauty. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating. Giovanni's dreams gradually became less frequent as his family's collection grew. It was as if his subconscious was somehow satisfied that the artworks were being protected. As more and more threatened pieces found their way into Medici collections, Giovanni's nightmares became less intense and less frequent. By the time he was 13, the dreams had stopped almost entirely. When Cosimo asked his son about this change, Giovanni said something that would stick with his father for the rest of his life. "I think the dreams stopped because the beautiful things aren't as scared anymore. They know someone is protecting them." Whether this was just childish reasoning or something more profound, it convinced Cosimo that his investment in art and culture was somehow cosmically important. Giovanni grew up to become one of the most influential art collectors and patrons in Florence, continuing and expanding his father's work. But he never forgot those childhood nightmares, and he later said they shaped his entire understanding of the relationship between art, culture, and human civilization. He argued that art wasn't just decoration or entertainment. It was a form of human knowledge that needed to be protected and preserved for future generations. The really eerie part of this story is that many of the specific artworks Giovanni had seen being destroyed in his dreams were later actually targeted during periods of religious extremism. The bonfire of the Vanities in 1497, organized by the monks of Savonarola, was exactly the kind of event Giovanni had been dreaming about: a public burning of books, paintings, and other vanities that were considered sinful distractions from religious devotion. During these events, crowds of people brought their personal collections of books, artworks, cosmetics, and other worldly possessions to be burned in huge bonfires in Florence's public squares. The destruction was systematic and thorough, exactly like what Giovanni had seen in his childhood dreams. Many of the specific pieces that were destroyed matched descriptions Giovanni had given decades earlier, down to details about their appearance and the manner of their destruction. The historical impact of the Medici family's art patronage cannot be overstated. They didn't just collect art, they created an entire economic and cultural system that supported artistic innovation. Their patronage model became the template for how wealthy families throughout Europe would support artists and intellectuals. The Renaissance spread from Florence to other Italian cities, and eventually throughout Europe, largely because the Medici family had demonstrated that supporting art and learning was both culturally important and economically viable. The artists supported by the Medici family created works that are still considered among the greatest achievements in human history. Michelangelo's sculptures, Botticelli's paintings, and countless other masterpieces exist today because a 10-year-old boy's nightmares convinced his father to become an art patron. The libraries established by the Medici family preserved manuscripts and books that would otherwise have been lost, maintaining continuity of knowledge through periods of religious and political upheaval. But perhaps most importantly, the Medici family's approach to art collection established the principle that cultural preservation is a social responsibility. They demonstrated that private wealth could be used to protect and promote human creativity, not just for personal enjoyment, but for the benefit of society as a whole. This idea would influence philanthropic approaches to art and education for centuries to come. Giovanni later wrote about his childhood dreams in a journal that survived in the Medici family archives. He described them as visions of a world where beauty had been declared the enemy of truth, where knowledge was considered dangerous, and where the human impulse to create was seen as a form of rebellion against God. He believed that his dreams were a warning about what could happen if societies chose fear over beauty, ignorance over knowledge, and conformity over creativity. The psychological and spiritual impact of these dreams on Giovanni extended far beyond his childhood. As an adult, he continued to have prophetic dreams about art and culture, though they were less frequent and less disturbing than his childhood nightmares. He claimed that these dreams helped him identify promising young artists and anticipate cultural trends that would shape the Renaissance. The Medici family's commitment to art patronage, inspired by Giovanni's childhood dreams, created a cultural renaissance that transformed not just Florence, but all of Europe. The artistic innovations supported by Medici patronage influenced everything from architecture to philosophy, from literature to science. The Renaissance ideal of the universal man, someone who could excel in multiple fields of knowledge and creativity, was embodied by many of the artists and scholars who worked under Medici protection. What started as a 10-year-old's nightmares about burning books became a cultural movement that celebrated human creativity, promoted learning, and established the principle that beauty and knowledge were essential to human flourishing. Giovanni's dreams and his father's decision to take them seriously helped create the intellectual and artistic foundation for the modern world. The story of Giovanni de' Medici reminds us that sometimes the most important insights come from sources we might easily dismiss. A child's nightmare about the destruction of beauty became the inspiration for one of history's greatest cultural achievements. It suggests that our dreams, especially those that disturb us most deeply, might contain warnings and wisdom that our conscious minds haven't yet recognized. Fast forward to 1815, and we've got what might be the most profitable dream in financial history. Nathan Rothschild's 8-year-old son James had a dream that basically built the foundation of the modern banking system, and it all started with a nightmare about his father being buried under a mountain of gold coins that somehow turned into rivers of light flowing across a map of Europe. Because apparently, even Rothschild children dream in metaphors about international finance. The Rothschild family was already doing well in the banking business by 1815, but they weren't yet the financial powerhouse they'd become. They were successful, sure, but in the way that a good local restaurant is successful, profitable, and respected in their immediate area, but not exactly dominating the global market. Nathan was running the London branch of the family bank, dealing with the absolute chaos of the Napoleonic Wars and trying to figure out how to make money when half of Europe was constantly at war with the other half, and the other half was probably planning to be at war with somebody else next week. The banking business in early 19th century Europe was basically controlled anarchy. Information traveled at the speed of horses, which meant that by the time you found out about a major political event, the market opportunities had either evaporated or been seized by someone with faster horses. Currency exchange rates fluctuated wildly based on rumors, wars, and whether or not Napoleon had indigestion on any given Tuesday. It was the kind of environment where fortunes could be made or lost based on a single piece of information arriving a few hours earlier than expected. Nathan Rothschild was good at this game, but he wasn't yet the master of it. He understood that information was the most valuable commodity in the financial world, but he was still operating within the conventional limitations of early 19th century communication technology. He had contacts, he had sources, he had a reputation for reliability, but he was still essentially playing by the same rules as every other banker in Europe. That's where little James Rothschild comes into our story. James had always been a practical kid, and I mean practical in the way that only children raised in banking families can be practical. This was an 8-year-old who counted his allowance money, asked pointed questions about why adults made such stupid financial decisions, and had opinions about currency exchange rates. Most kids his age were playing with wooden toys and trying not to get kicked by horses. James was analyzing the economic implications of the continental system and wondering why his father's competitors were such idiots. But in the spring of 1815, something changed. James started having incredibly vivid dreams about networks of information flowing across Europe like rivers of light. And I'm not talking about vague, dreamy metaphors here. These were detailed, specific visions that would make modern data visualization experts weep with envy. In his dreams, James could see information moving across the continent as physical streams of golden light. He watched messages traveling between cities, but instead of seeing horses and riders, he could somehow perceive the information itself, like glowing threads that connected London to Paris, to Frankfurt, to Naples, to Vienna. The information had weight, speed, and direction. Some threads were thick and bright, carrying important news about battles and political decisions. Others were thin and dim, carrying routine commercial information or personal correspondence. But here's where the dream gets really specific and weird. James could see bottlenecks in the information flow, places where messages got delayed or lost, where communication networks broke down, where competing bankers were losing opportunities because they simply didn't know what was happening. He watched information pile up like water behind a dam, then burst through in sudden floods that overwhelmed unprepared recipients. And in his dream, James realized that whoever could control these information rivers, whoever could speed them up, redirect them, or create new channels where none existed, would have an enormous advantage over everyone else, who was still waiting for news to arrive through normal channels. When James woke up from these dreams, he immediately ran to his father and started babbling about information rivers and message networks, and golden threads connecting all the cities where people trade money. Most adults would have patted the kid on the head, given him a cookie, and told him to go play with something that wouldn't give him such weird dreams. But Nathan Rothschild was the kind of man who paid attention to patterns, even when those patterns came from 8-year-olds having bizarre visions about financial data flows. The thing about Nathan was that he'd been thinking about similar problems for months. The existing system of information transmission across Europe was, to put it mildly, completely chaotic. News traveled at the speed of horses, which meant that depending on weather, road conditions, political situations, and whether or not your messenger got robbed by bandits, critical information could take anywhere from days to weeks to reach its destination. Whoever could speed up that process, whoever could create reliable communication networks that operated faster than their competitors, would have access to market advantages that could generate enormous profits. James's dreams were describing, in the language of an 8-year-old's imagination, exactly the kind of information infrastructure that Nathan had been trying to figure out how to build. The boy was talking about networks, redundancy, speed optimization, and competitive advantages. He just happened to be describing these concepts in terms of golden rivers and magical threads, instead of using proper financial terminology. So Nathan did something that probably seemed completely insane to his contemporaries and absolutely brilliant in hindsight. He decided to take his 8-year-old son's dreams seriously as business advice. He invested what was, for the time, an absolutely staggering amount of money in creating his own private information network across Europe. This wasn't just a matter of hiring a few fast riders. Nathan created an entire communication infrastructure that included the fastest horses, the most reliable riders, strategically positioned relay stations across multiple countries, backup routes for when primary paths were blocked by weather or politics, and even carrier pigeons for speeding up message delivery over shorter distances. He basically built the 19th century equivalent of a private internet, except instead of fiber optic cables, he was using horses, boats, and birds. The investment was enormous and risky. Nathan was spending money on communication infrastructure faster than most people spent money on food and shelter. His competitors probably thought he'd lost his mind. Who spends that kind of fortune on sending messages slightly faster than everyone else? But Nathan understood what his son's dreams had shown him. In the financial world, information advantages compound exponentially. Being first with important news doesn't just give you a small edge. It can give you opportunities that don't exist for anyone who receives the same information even a few hours later. The investment paid off spectacularly and in exactly the way James had predicted in his dreams. When the Battle of Waterloo was fought on June 1815, Nathan Rothschild received confirmation of Napoleon's defeat a full day before the British government got the news. And just like in his son's dream, Nathan used this advance information to make massive profits in government bonds. But here's the really wild part. The specific details of how Nathan received and used this information matched James's dream descriptions almost exactly. The boy had seen information flowing from Belgium to London along a particular route, arriving at a specific time of day and being used to make financial decisions that would affect the prices of government securities. And that's precisely what happened. Nathan knew that Napoleon's defeat would cause British government bonds to rise dramatically in value. while most other investors still thought Britain might lose the war. So he spent the entire day quietly buying up British securities at depressed prices, while other investors were still panicking about the possibility of a French victory. When the official news of Waterloo finally reached London, Nathan had already positioned himself to profit enormously from the market movements that followed. The profits from that single day of trading were staggering. Nathan made enough money to fund massive expansions of the family banking business. And more importantly, he demonstrated the enormous value of superior information networks. Other bankers immediately began trying to copy the Rothschild communication system, but Nathan had a crucial head start and the financial resources to maintain his advantage. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. That single successful trade, based on information advantages that stemmed from James's dream, provided the capital foundation for the entire Rothschild banking empire. The family used their early profits to establish banks across Europe, creating a financial network that would dominate international banking for the next century. James later said that he could remember every detail of that prophetic dream, the way the information looked like golden threads connecting distant cities. The specific route the news took from the battlefield in Belgium to his father's office in London, even the exact time of day when Nathan would receive the crucial message about Napoleon's defeat. And all of it turned out to be accurate down to the smallest details. As James grew older, his dreams evolved and became even more sophisticated. He started seeing not just how information moved, but how it could be used to predict market movements, political changes, and economic opportunities. He dreamed about financial instruments that didn't exist yet, about banking techniques that wouldn't be developed for decades, about economic relationships between countries that were still being formed. The Rothschild Information Network, inspired by an 8-year-old's dream about glowing threads of communication, basically created the template for modern financial intelligence gathering. The family's success was built on their ability to know things before their competitors knew them, to understand market movements before those movements became obvious to everyone else, and to position themselves advantageously for changes that other people couldn't see coming. But James's dreams weren't just about communication networks. They were about the fundamental nature of information itself in the modern world. He saw that in an increasingly connected global economy, information would become the most valuable commodity. Raw materials, manufactured goods, even gold and silver would become less important than the ability to know what was happening and to communicate that knowledge, quickly and accurately. This insight, originating from a child's dream about golden rivers of light, helped establish the philosophical foundation for modern capitalism. The Rothschilds understood, before almost anyone else, that the real source of wealth in the modern world wouldn't be land or natural resources or even manufacturing capacity. It would be information processing and network effects. The family's banking empire expanded rapidly throughout the 19th century, establishing branches in every major European financial center. But more importantly, they created the operational model for how international finance would work in the modern world. Their communication networks, their information gathering techniques, their approach to risk management and international coordination, all of these innovations can be traced back to James's childhood dreams about information flowing like light between distant cities. James himself grew up to become one of the most influential bankers in Europe, continuing and expanding his father's work. But he never forgot those childhood dreams, and he always credited them with teaching him the most important lesson about finance: that money follows information, and whoever controls the flow of information controls the flow of wealth. The psychological impact of those dreams extended far beyond their immediate financial implications. James later wrote that the dreams taught him to think about business in terms of networks and systems rather than just individual transactions. He learned to see patterns that connected distant events, to understand how information in one place could affect opportunities in completely different places, and to think strategically about infrastructure investments that might not pay off for years but would eventually provide enormous competitive advantages. The Rothschild family's approach to banking, inspired by an 8-year-old's dreams about information networks, helped create the modern global financial system. Their techniques for international communication, currency exchange, and risk management became standard practices throughout the banking industry. They demonstrated that in an interconnected world, success depends not just on having money, but on having better information than your competitors. Today's high-frequency trading algorithms, satellite communication systems, and global financial networks are essentially high-tech versions of the same basic principles James saw in his childhood dreams. Information is power. Speed is money, and whoever can process and transmit knowledge faster than everyone else will control the markets. The story of James Rothschild's dreams reminds us that some of the most important innovations in human history have come from insights that initially seemed impossible or impractical. An 8-year-old's vision of information flowing like golden light across Europe became the blueprint for the modern financial system. It suggests that our most powerful technologies and institutions often begin as someone's seemingly impossible dream about how the world could work differently. Dreams don't just happen to you, they happen through you. And sometimes they happen through minds young enough to imagine solutions that adults have learned to consider impossible. Let's travel to 1860s Japan, where a 12-year-old princess's dreams about ships that sail without wind convinced her father to abandon centuries of isolation and open Japan to the modern world. And if you think that sounds like an exaggeration, just wait until you hear about the incredibly specific technological visions this kid was having about steam engines, electric lights, and railroad networks, all while living in a country that had been deliberately cut off from the outside world for over 250 years. Princess Masako was Emperor Meiji's eldest daughter, living in the carefully controlled world of the imperial palace during one of the most turbulent periods in Japanese history. This was 1867, and Japan had been virtually sealed off from the outside world since the early 1600s under the Tokugawa shogunate's isolation policy known as Sakoku. Most Japanese people had never seen a foreigner, a steam engine, or any of the technological innovations that were rapidly transforming the rest of the world during the Industrial Revolution. To understand just how isolated Japan was, imagine living in a country where the most advanced technology was still essentially medieval. The fastest way to travel was on horseback. The most efficient way to communicate over long distances was by sending messages with human runners. The most powerful weapons were swords and traditional firearms that hadn't changed, designed significantly since the 1600s, while Europe and America were building railroads, telegraph systems, and steam-powered factories. Japan was still operating under a feudal system where most people lived and died in the same village where they were born. Princess Masako was 12 years old in 1867, which meant she'd been born into this isolated world and had never experienced anything beyond traditional Japanese culture and technology. She'd never seen a photograph, never heard about electricity, never imagined that ships could move without wind or that messages could travel faster than a horse could run. Her education consisted of traditional Japanese arts, literature, and court protocol. She was being prepared for a life of ceremonial duties within the rigid hierarchy of the imperial court. But starting in 1867, something extraordinary began happening. Princess Masako started having incredibly detailed dreams about technologies that didn't exist in Japan, and that she'd never heard described by anyone. She dreamed about massive ships moving across the ocean without sails, powered by clouds of steam that poured from tall chimneys. She saw carriages that moved without horses, buildings that reached toward the sky like mountains, and machines that could speak to each other across vast distances without any visible connection. At first, her tutors and court officials dismissed these dreams as childish fantasies. After all, what 12-year-old doesn't have vivid dreams about impossible things? But Masako's descriptions were becoming increasingly specific and technical. She'd wake up and immediately start sketching the mechanisms she'd seen in her sleep: gear systems, steam pistons, electrical circuits, mechanical components that she had no conscious knowledge of and no context for understanding. The really disturbing part, from the court's perspective, was that her dreams weren't just about technology, they were about Japan's future. She saw Japanese people wearing Western clothing, living in Western-style buildings, and working with Western machines. And in every dream, she sensed that Japan had to choose between embracing these changes or being left behind by the rest of the world. What made these dreams so historically significant was their timing and their emotional impact on Emperor Meiji. Japan was already under enormous pressure from Western powers to end its isolation policy. American Commodore Matthew Perry had forced Japan to open its ports in 1854, and European powers were demanding trading rights and diplomatic relations. The Tokugawa shogunate was collapsing, and the young Emperor Meiji was facing the choice between continuing Japan's isolation or rapidly modernizing to compete with Western powers. But this was an incredibly difficult decision. Opening Japan to the outside world meant abandoning centuries of tradition, dismantling the feudal system that had provided stability for over 200 years, and essentially reinventing Japanese society from the ground up. It meant taking enormous risks with no guarantee of success. Many Japanese leaders believed that modernization would destroy Japanese culture and identity, turning Japan into a weak imitation of Western countries. Into this political and cultural crisis came Princess Masako's dreams, providing a visceral, emotional dimension to what had been primarily a strategic and political decision. She wasn't just describing abstract, technological possibilities. She was showing her father what Japan could become if it chose to embrace change. Masako would describe not just what she saw in her dreams, but how it felt, the excitement of riding in a steam-powered vehicle, the wonder of seeing electric lights illuminate an entire city, the pride of watching Japanese people master these new technologies and use them to build something even better than what existed in the Western world. The turning point came when Masako described a specific type of steamship in perfect detail. She drew pictures of the vessel's design, described its steam engine configuration, and even specified details about its propulsion system and fuel requirements. She said this ship would arrive in Tokyo Bay carrying important messages about Japan's future relationships with other countries. 2 weeks later, a ship matching her exact description arrived in Tokyo Bay. This wasn't just coincidence. It was as if her dreams were somehow connected to events that were already in motion but hadn't yet reached Japan. The ship was carrying Western diplomats with proposals for trade agreements and technological assistance that would help Japan modernize its military and industrial capabilities. But Masako's dreams included darker visions as well. She saw what would happen if Japan remained isolated. Foreign ships arriving with superior weapons, Japanese cities being overwhelmed by forces they couldn't understand or resist, the country becoming a colony of more technologically advanced powers. She described scenarios where Japan's traditional weapons and military strategies proved completely inadequate against Western artillery and naval power. These prophetic nightmares were particularly disturbing because they showed specific battles and defeats that would occur if Japan continued to reject modernization. Masako described Japanese samurai charging against Western cannons, traditional wooden ships being destroyed by steam-powered warships, and Japanese cities being occupied by foreign armies, equipped with technologies that seemed like magic to people who had never seen them before. What made these dreams so emotionally powerful was that Masako wasn't just describing abstract military scenarios. She was showing her father the human cost of remaining isolated. She described the humiliation and suffering of Japanese people who would be defeated by technologies they couldn't understand, the loss of Japanese independence and cultural identity that would result from being colonized by Western powers. Emperor Meiji was already under enormous pressure from various political factions about whether to end Japan's isolation policy, but his daughter's dreams provided a compelling emotional argument for why modernization wasn't just politically necessary, it was essential for Japan's survival as an independent nation. The really remarkable aspect of Masako's dreams was their specificity about how modernization should proceed. She didn't just see that Japan needed to adopt Western technology, she saw how Japanese people could improve upon Western innovations and create uniquely Japanese solutions to technological challenges. In her dreams, Japanese engineers were taking Western steam engine designs and making them more efficient. Japanese craftsmen were combining traditional Japanese aesthetics with Western architectural techniques to create buildings that were both beautiful and practical. Japanese scholars were studying Western scientific methods and using them to make discoveries that Western scientists hadn't thought of. Masako's dreams weren't about Japan becoming a copy of Western countries. They were about Japan becoming a bridge between traditional Eastern wisdom and modern Western technology. She saw a future where Japanese culture and identity would be preserved and strengthened through selective adoption of foreign innovations. This vision of selective modernization proved to be incredibly prescient. The Meiji Restoration, which began in 1868, was characterized by the slogan "Wakan Yusai," Japanese spirit, Western technology. Instead of completely abandoning Japanese culture, the Meiji government carefully chose which Western innovations to adopt and how to integrate them with Japanese traditions. Emperor Meiji made the decision to end Japan's isolation and begin rapid modernization. The Meiji Restoration transformed Japan from a feudal society into a modern industrial power in just a few decades. The country that had been completely isolated from the world in 1850 became a major military and economic power by 1900. But what makes this story even more fascinating is that Masako's dreams proved to be remarkably accurate about the specific path Japanese modernization would take. The technologies she had seen in her dreams, railroads, telegraph systems, electric power, steam-powered factories, were exactly the innovations that Japan prioritized during the Meiji period. And I'm not talking about lucky guesses here. This 12-year-old was describing specific engineering solutions and implementation, strategies that wouldn't be officially developed by Japanese experts for another decade. The railroad network that connected Japan's major cities followed routes that were remarkably similar to what Masako had described in her dreams. She had seen iron tracks winding through mountain passes, crossing rivers on bridges that looked like they were made of steel and stone, connecting cities that were separated by hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. When Japanese engineers finally began surveying potential railway routes in the 1870s, they discovered that the most efficient paths matched almost exactly what a 12-year-old girl had drawn in her dream sketches years earlier. The telegraph system that enabled rapid communication across the country used technologies that matched her dream descriptions with uncanny precision. Masako had seen invisible threads carrying messages between distant cities, and she described how these message threads could be strung on tall wooden poles that stretched across the landscape like a giant spider web. When Western telegraph technology was finally introduced to Japan, the installation process looked exactly like what she had envisioned. The electric power systems that illuminated Japanese cities were implemented using techniques that she had somehow visualized years before they were actually developed. In her dreams, she had seen how captured lightning could be channeled through metal wires to create light that didn't require fire or oil. She described power generation facilities that looked like temples but made sounds like waterfalls, and electric lights that could turn night into day at the flip of a switch. Even more remarkably, many of the specific challenges that Japan faced during modernization were things that Masako had seen in her dreams and warned her father about. She had predicted that the biggest difficulty would be training Japanese people to work with new technologies while maintaining their cultural identity. She had foreseen that Western powers would try to dominate Japan economically and politically, and that Japan would need to develop its own technological capabilities to maintain independence. Her dreams about Japanese people combining traditional aesthetics with Western functionality proved prophetic in ways that influenced Japanese design philosophy for centuries. The concept of wa, harmony between traditional and modern elements, that became central to Japanese. Industrial design was essentially what Masako had seen in her childhood visions. She had watched Japanese craftsmen take Western mechanical principles and create products that were both technically superior and uniquely beautiful. Princess Masako later became one of the most influential advocates for women's education in Japan, arguing that her dreams had shown her that the modern world would need people who could think creatively about new technologies. This wasn't just feminist politics, this was strategic thinking based on prophetic visions. She had seen that Japan's success in the modern world would depend on having citizens who could innovate and adapt, not just copy Western ideas. The educational institutions that Masako founded produced many of the engineers, scientists, and inventors who would lead Japan's continued technological development into the 20th century. Her approach of combining traditional Japanese learning methods with Western, scientific principles became the model for Japan's entire educational system. Students learned to think systematically like Western scientists while maintaining the attention to detail and aesthetic sensitivity that characterized traditional Japanese craftsmanship. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Masako's dreams was their long-term accuracy about Japan's technological future. Many of the specific innovations she had seen, bullet trains, advanced telecommunication systems, robotics, precision manufacturing, wouldn't be invented for decades or even centuries. But when they were finally developed, Japan was ready to not just adopt them, but to improve on them and become a world leader in technological innovation. The bullet trains that began operating in Japan in the 1960s used principles that Masako had described in her 1860s, dreams about iron horses that fly across the land faster than birds. She had seen trains that moved so smoothly and quickly that passengers could barely feel the motion. Trains that could cross the entire country in a few hours rather than the days it took by traditional transportation. The Shinkansen bullet train system that became the model for high-speed rail worldwide was essentially the fulfillment of a 12-year-old's impossible dreams. The telecommunications networks that connected Japan to the rest of the world used technologies that matched her visions of voices traveling through the air like invisible threads. She had dreamed about people in Tokyo speaking instantly with people in distant countries, about images being transmitted across vast distances, about information flowing between Japan and the world as easily as water flowing in a river. The modern Japanese telecommunications industry, with its emphasis on miniaturization and efficiency, reflected the same principles she had seen in her childhood dreams. The precision manufacturing techniques that made Japan famous for quality products were based on approaches that she had somehow visualized over a century before they were actually developed. In her dreams, she had seen Japanese workshops where craftsmen used machines to create products that were more perfect than anything that could be made by hand alone. She had watched Japanese workers combining traditional attention to detail with Western, mechanical precision to create goods that were both functional and beautiful. The psychological impact of these dreams on both Masako and her father extended far beyond their immediate political consequences. For Masako, the dreams provided a sense of purpose and direction that shaped her entire life. She understood that she had been given a glimpse of Japan's potential future, and she dedicated herself to helping make that vision reality. She never married, instead choosing to focus on education and cultural development, projects that would prepare Japan for the technological challenges she had seen in her dreams. For Emperor Meiji, his daughter's dreams provided emotional validation for one of the most difficult decisions in Japanese history. Instead of just responding to external pressure from Western powers, he was able to see modernization as an opportunity to fulfill Japan's potential as a nation. The dreams helped him understand that opening Japan to the world wasn't about abandoning Japanese identity, it was about allowing Japanese culture to evolve and flourish in a changing world. The really profound aspect of Masako's influence was how she helped her father frame modernization as a form of cultural preservation rather than cultural abandonment. Her dreams showed that Japan could adopt Western technologies while maintaining its essential character, that modernization could strengthen rather than weaken Japanese identity. This psychological framework became crucial to Japan's successful transition from feudal isolation to modern industrial power. The story of Princess Masako's dreams also demonstrates how children's unconscious minds can sometimes process complex political and technological information that their conscious minds can't yet understand. Masako was too young to comprehend the full implications of Japan's isolation policy or the technical details of Western industrial development, but her dreams captured the essential dynamics of technological change and cultural adaptation with remarkable accuracy. Today, Japan is known worldwide for its technological innovation, particularly in areas like robotics, electronics, and transportation. The country that was completely isolated from the world in 8067 became one of the most technologically advanced nations on Earth, and much of this transformation can be traced back to the dreams of a 12-year-old princes who somehow saw the future with remarkable clarity. The concept of kaizen, continuous improvement, that became central to Japanese manufacturing and business practices was essentially what Masako had seen in her dreams about Japanese people taking Western technologies and making them better. The Japanese approach to robotics, which emphasizes harmony between humans and machines, reflected her vision of technology serving human needs rather than replacing human capabilities. The modern Japanese economy, with its emphasis on precision, efficiency, and aesthetic appeal, embodies the synthesis of traditional and modern elements that Masako had envisioned in her childhood dreams. From the minimalist design of Japanese electronics to the extraordinary efficiency of Japanese manufacturing systems, the country's technological development followed the path she had seen in her sleep over a century ago. But perhaps most importantly, Masako's dreams remind us that some of the most important historical transformations begin with individual visions that seem impossible at the time. A 12-year-old girl's dreams about steam engines and electric lights helped convince her father to abandon centuries of isolation and transform Japan into a modern nation. Her visions of Japanese people mastering new technologies while preserving their cultural identity became the blueprint for one of the most successful modernization efforts in human history. The psychological authenticity of her dreams, her genuine excitement about technological possibilities, combined with her deep concern for preserving Japanese culture, provided the emotional foundation for a rational policy decision that changed the course of world history. Sometimes the most important insights come not from expert analysis or strategic planning, but from the unconscious wisdom of those who can see possibilities that adults have learned to dismiss as impossible. Dreams don't just happen to you, they happen through you. And sometimes they happen through minds young enough to envision futures that seem impossible until they become inevitable. Our final main story takes us to 1830s America, where 9-year-old Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr.'s recurring dreams about iron horses racing across the continent convinced his father to abandon the shipping business and bet everything on railroads. And if that sounds like a risky business decision based on a kid's imagination, just wait until you hear about the incredibly detailed maps this boy was drawing of railway routes that wouldn't exist for another 20 years. Cornelius Vanderbilt Sr., who would later become known as the Commodore, was already successful in the steamboat business by 1835, controlling much of the waterway transportation around New York. He was making excellent money ferrying passengers and cargo between Staten Island and Manhattan, and had built a reputation as one of the most reliable and efficient operators on the water. The steamboat business was booming, and Vanderbilt Sr. had no particular interest in the newfangled railroad technology that was just beginning to appear in America. To understand why this was such a radical decision, you have to realize that in the 1830s, railroads were still experimental technology. The first successful steam locomotive in America had only been operating since 1830, and most people still considered trains to be slow, unreliable, and probably a fad that would never compete with water transportation. Rivers and waterways were the natural highways of America. They'd been the primary means of moving goods and people since the country was founded. Why would anyone abandon a successful water transportation business to gamble on unproven railroad technology? But 9-year-old Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr. kept having the most vivid dreams about networks of iron rails stretching across the entire American continent. And when I say vivid, I mean the kind of detailed, systematic visions that would make modern transportation planners weep with envy. This wasn't a kid dreaming about toy trains. This was a boy who was somehow seeing the future infrastructure of an entire nation. In his dreams, Cornelius Jr. saw trains moving faster than any horse, carrying hundreds of people and massive amounts of cargo across distances that would take weeks to travel by wagon. But what made these dreams so compelling wasn't just their scope, it was their incredible specificity. The boy would wake up and immediately start drawing maps of railway routes that didn't exist yet. describing in detail how trains would connect cities that were separated by hundreds of miles of wilderness. These weren't crude childhood sketches. Cornelius Jr. was drawing maps that showed exact topographical features, optimal routes through mountain passes, strategic locations for bridges and tunnels, and efficient connections between major population centers. He'd talk about iron bridges spanning rivers that hadn't been bridged yet, tunnels carved through mountains that hadn't been surveyed, and stations that looked like palaces in towns that were still just frontier settlements. The really unsettling part was that the boy seemed to understand not just the engineering challenges of railroad construction, but the economic implications. He'd point to spots on his imaginary maps and say, "There's going to be a huge city here because the trains will stop here," or "This place is going to become empty because the trains will go around it." He was essentially predicting the economic geography of 19th century America based on railroad infrastructure that hadn't been built yet. And he was doing all of this with the casual confidence of someone describing what he'd had for breakfast. Most 9-year-olds can barely draw a recognizable house, but Cornelius Jr. was sketching detailed transportation networks that would reshape an entire continent. Vanderbilt Sr. initially dismissed these dreams as childish imagination, and honestly, who could blame him? The kid was talking about railway lines that would span thousands of miles, connecting the Atlantic coast to territories that were still largely unexplored. He was describing engineering projects that would require moving mountains, bridging vast rivers, and coordinating construction efforts across multiple states. It sounded like the fevered imagination of a boy who'd read too many adventure stories. But then something started to bother Vanderbilt Sr. His son's predictions were becoming increasingly specific and detailed. Cornelius Jr. would describe not just where railway lines should go, but exactly how they should be built, what kind of rail gauge to use, how to design locomotives for maximum efficiency, even how to organize freight and passenger services for optimal profitability. The turning point came when Vanderbilt Sr. started checking his son's predictions against early railroad development plans that were being discussed in business circles. Engineers and investors were beginning to survey potential railroad routes, and Vanderbilt Sr. discovered that the boy's imaginary rail networks matched almost exactly with the routes that professional surveyors were secretly investigating. The breakthrough moment came when Cornelius Jr. described a specific bridge design that would be needed to cross the Hudson River, a suspension bridge with towers that looked like Gothic cathedrals, capable of supporting the weight of fully loaded freight trains. When Vanderbilt Sr. investigated, he discovered that engineers were already working on preliminary designs for exactly such a bridge, using architectural plans that his son had never seen one. The boy had somehow dreamed about engineering solutions to problems that professional railroad builders were still trying to solve. He was describing construction techniques that were years ahead of current technology, transportation logistics that wouldn't be implemented for decades, and economic strategies that would eventually become standard practice in the railroad industry. That's when Vanderbilt Sr. made one of the most successful career changes in business history. He made the decision to sell his steamboat empire and invest everything in railroad development. This wasn't just changing jobs. This was abandoning a proven, profitable business to gamble on an unproven technology based on his 9-year-old son's dreams. The financial risk was enormous. Vanderbilt Sr. had built his steamboat business over many years, establishing relationships with customers, suppliers, and competitors. He understood the water transportation market intimately. He knew which routes were profitable, which competitors were threats, and how to navigate the complex web of regulations and politics that governed river and coastal shipping. Railroads were completely different. The technology was new and unreliable. The regulatory environment was chaotic and constantly changing. The construction costs were massive and unpredictable. Most railroad companies were going bankrupt faster than they could lay track. For a successful businessman to abandon water transportation for railroads was like a modern tech executive abandoning a profitable software company to invest in experimental space travel. But Vanderbilt Sr. had learned to trust his son's unusual insights. The boy had demonstrated an uncanny ability to see patterns and opportunities that adults missed. And more importantly, Cornelius Jr. S. dreams weren't just about technology, they were about transformation. He was seeing how railroads would fundamentally change American society, economy, and culture. The Vanderbilt Railroad Empire became one of the largest business enterprises in American history, and Cornelius Sr. became one of the richest men in the world. But here's the really wild part. As Cornelius Jr. grew up, his dreams became less about what railroads would look like and more about what they would do to society. The boy predicted that railroads would make the American frontier disappear, turning the continent into a single connected economic system. He saw how trains would change the way people lived, worked, and thought about distance and time. He understood that railroads wouldn't just transport goods and people, they would transport ideas, cultures, and opportunities, and he was absolutely right. The railroad boom that his childhood dreams had inspired basically created modern America. Cities grew up along rail lines. Industries developed around railroad logistics. And the entire social structure of the country was transformed by the ability to move people and goods quickly across vast distances. But Cornelius Jr.'s dreams extended far beyond his father's immediate business interests. He started having visions about transportation technologies that wouldn't be invented for decades. He dreamed about vehicles that could move without rails, about flying machines that could cross the continent in hours, about communication systems that could connect distant places instantly. The really remarkable thing was that his dreams weren't just about individual technologies. They were about systems. He understood that transportation, communication, and economic development were all interconnected. He saw that the railroad networks he'd envisioned would create the foundation for even more advanced transportation systems that would follow. When Cornelius Jr. dreamed about automobiles in the 1840s, he wasn't just seeing horseless carriages, he was seeing how personal transportation would change where people lived and worked. When he dreamed about airplanes, he wasn't just seeing flying machines. He was seeing how aviation would shrink the world and create new forms of international commerce. The psychological impact of these dreams on both father and son was profound. For Vanderbilt Sr., his son's visions provided a sense of purpose and direction that went beyond simple profit-making. He wasn't just building a railroad company, he was participating in the creation of a new kind of civilization. For Cornelius Jr., the dreams provided a lifelong sense of mission. He understood that he had been given a glimpse of America's potential future, and he dedicated himself to helping make that vision reality. Even after his father's death, he continued to advocate for transportation innovations and infrastructure investments that would connect the country and promote economic development. The Vanderbilt Railroad Empire, inspired by a 9-year-old's dreams about iron horses racing across the continent, basically built the infrastructure foundation for America's industrial, revolution. The New York Central Railroad became one of the most important transportation arteries in the country, connecting the Atlantic coast to the Great Lakes and eventually to the Pacific Ocean. But more importantly, the Vanderbilt approach to railroad development established the template for how large-scale infrastructure projects would be organized and financed in America. Their methods for raising capital, coordinating construction, and managing complex transportation networks became the model for highway systems, telecommunications networks, and other infrastructure projects that would follow. The economic impact was staggering. The Vanderbilt railroads didn't just move goods and people, they created entire industries. Steel production, coal mining, lumber harvesting, and manufacturing all expanded rapidly to serve the needs of railroad construction and operation. Towns and cities grew up along railroad routes, creating new markets and opportunities for millions of Americans. The social impact was equally profound. Railroads made it possible for people to travel long distances quickly and affordably, breaking down the isolation that had characterized much of American life. Families could stay in touch across great distances, young people could seek opportunities in distant cities, and ideas could spread rapidly across the continent. Cornelius Jr. later wrote about his childhood dreams in a journal that was preserved by the family. He described them as visions of America's destiny as a connected nation. where distance would no longer be a barrier to opportunity and where the fruits of human ingenuity could be shared by all. He believed that his dreams were a form of prophecy, but not in a supernatural sense. Instead, he thought they represented his unconscious mind's ability to recognize patterns and possibilities that his conscious mind couldn't yet understand. He saw his dreams as a form of strategic thinking that operated below the level of rational analysis. The really fascinating aspect of Cornelius Jr.'s dreams was their accuracy over time. Not only did his predictions about railroad development prove correct, but his visions of future transportation technologies were remarkably prescient. He had described automobiles, airplanes, and interstate highways decades before they were actually developed. The interstate highway system that was built in the 1950s followed routes that were remarkably similar to what Cornelius Jr. had drawn in his childhood railroad maps. The airports that became major transportation hubs were located in cities that he had identified as strategic connection points. The communication networks that eventually connected the country used infrastructure that followed the same geographic logic he had seen in his dreams. Today, when we look at America's transportation infrastructure, the highways, railways, airports, and communication networks that connect the country, we're essentially seeing the fulfillment of a 9-year-old's dreams from the 1830s. The vision of America as a connected continent, where goods, people, and ideas can move freely across vast distances, originated with a boy who dreamed about iron horses racing across the wilderness. The story of Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr. S. Dreams reminds us that some of the most important developments in human history begin with individuals who can see possibilities that others consider impossible. A child's vision of continental railroad networks became the blueprint for American infrastructure development. His dreams about transportation systems that didn't exist yet provided the strategic foundation for one of the most successful business empires in history. And perhaps most importantly, his story demonstrates that the most powerful technologies and institutions often begin as someone seemingly impossible. Dream about how the world could work differently. The modern American economy, with its emphasis on mobility, connectivity, and rapid communication, can be traced back to a 9-year-old's dreams about iron horses racing across the continent. Dreams don't just happen to you, they happen through you. And sometimes they happen through minds young enough to envision solutions that adults have learned to consider impossible. The next time you board a train, drive on a highway, or send a message across the country, remember that you're participating in the fulfillment of a child's dream about connecting a continent. Let's slow down a bit and explore some shorter but equally fascinating stories about children whose dreams change the adult world in unexpected ways. And our first tale takes us to 1527, where 7-year-old Princess Mary Tudor, who would later become Queen Mary I of England, also known as Bloody Mary, had a series of dreams that indirectly influenced her father, King Henry VIII's decision to break away from the Catholic Church. But not in the way you might expect. Mary's dreams weren't about religious doctrine, papal authority, or political power. They weren't filled with theological debates or visions of Protestant Reformation. Instead, she kept dreaming about her mother, Catherine of Aragon, being locked away in a tower while strange men in black robes burned all her beautiful clothes and jewelry. In the dreams, young Mary would try desperately to reach her mother, but there was always a massive wall that kept growing higher and higher between them, no matter how hard she tried to climb it or find a way around it. These weren't the typical childhood nightmares about monsters under the bed or getting lost in the woods. Mary's dreams were emotionally devastating scenarios of separation and loss that felt more real than her waking life. She'd wake up sobbing, not from fear, but from a profound sense of grief that seemed too mature and complex for a 7-year-old to experience. What made these dreams historically significant was their timing and their psychological impact on both Mary and her father. Henry VIII was already struggling with his conscience about annulling his marriage to Catherine, dealing with enormous pressure from the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and various English nobles who had different opinions about what he should do. The king was caught between his desire to remarry and produce a male heir, his respect for the Catholic Church, and his genuine affection for both Catherine and Mary. But watching his young daughter wake up night after night, crying about losing her mother forever, started to eat away at Henry's resolve. Mary would run to her father's chambers in the middle of the night, describing how in her dreams she felt like she was losing her mother forever, how the men in black robes were taking away everything that connected her to Catherine, how the wall between them kept growing until she couldn't even hear her mother's voice anymore. The emotional authenticity of Mary's distress was impossible for Henry to ignore. This wasn't a child throwing tantrums to get her way. This was genuine, psychological anguish from a little girl who sensed that her family was about to be torn apart. Henry, despite his many faults, was genuinely devoted to his daughter and was deeply disturbed by her obvious suffering. The irony is almost overwhelming when you think about it. Mary's dreams about separation from her mother may have actually pushed Henry toward the very decision that would make those dreams come true. Her nightmares about losing Catherine convinced Henry that his marriage troubles were having a profound psychological impact on his daughter, and that he needed to resolve the situation quickly, one way or another. But here's what makes this story even more complex. Mary's dreams seem to be predicting not just the immediate consequences of Henry's decision, but the long-term effects on English society and religion. In her nightmares, she saw not just her own separation from her mother, but entire communities being divided, families being torn apart, and people being forced to choose between their old beliefs and new requirements. The 7-year-old princess was somehow dreaming about the religious and social upheaval that would follow Henry's break with Rome. She saw churches being stripped of their decorations, monasteries being dissolved, and people being punished for maintaining their traditional Catholic beliefs. These weren't things a child her age should have understood or been able to imagine, but they appeared in her dreams with disturbing accuracy. Henry's courtiers and advisors noticed that the king's determination to annul his marriage seemed to intensify after Mary's particularly bad nights. When she'd wake up screaming about walls separating her from her mother, Henry would spend the following days in urgent consultations with Thomas Cranmer and other supporters of the annulment. It was as if Mary's emotional distress provided him with additional justification for the radical action he was already inclined to take. The really tragic aspect of this story is how accurate Mary's dreams proved to be. When Henry did break from Rome and dissolve his marriage to Catherine, Mary was indeed separated from her mother for the rest of Catherine's life. The relationship between father and daughter never fully recovered, and Mary spent years being declared illegitimate and cut off from the royal succession. But Mary's childhood dreams about religious persecution also proved prophetic in ways that wouldn't become clear for decades. When she eventually became queen, Mary's reign was characterized by the same kind of religious violence and family separation that she had seen in her childhood nightmares. Her attempt to restore Catholicism in England involved burning Protestant reformers at the stake and forcing families to choose between their religious convictions and their personal safety. The psychological impact of those childhood dreams seems to have shaped Mary's entire approach to religion and power. She spent her adult life trying to undo the consequences of her father's decision, attempting to rebuild the Catholic Church in England and reunite the English people with Rome. But in doing so, she recreated many of the same patterns of separation and persecution that had haunted her childhood dreams. The men in black robes that appeared in her dreams might have represented the Protestant reformers who would eventually gain power during her brother Edward's reign. The burning of beautiful clothes and jewelry could have symbolized the destruction of Catholic art and liturgical objects that occurred during the English Reformation. The ever-growing wall between Mary and her mother might have represented the permanent religious divide that Henry's decision would create in English society. What's particularly striking is how Mary's dreams captured not just the personal consequences of her father's actions, but their broader historical significance. The English Reformation that began with Henry's desire to remarry eventually transformed England into a Protestant nation, fundamentally changing English culture, politics, and international relationships. A 7-year-old's nightmares about family separation somehow contained the seeds of these much larger historical changes. The emotional power of Mary's dreams also demonstrates how children's unconscious minds can sometimes process complex political and social situations that their conscious minds can't yet understand. Mary was too young to comprehend the theological and political implications of her father's conflict with the Pope, but her dreams captured the essential emotional reality of what was happening, that her family and her world were about to be permanently altered. Modern psychologists might interpret Mary's dreams as her unconscious mind's way of processing the tension and uncertainty she sensed in the royal household. Children are often more sensitive to emotional undercurrents than adults realize, and Mary might have been picking up on subtle signs that her parents' marriage was in trouble, even if she couldn't consciously understand what those signs meant. But the historical timing and accuracy of her dreams suggests something more than just childhood anxiety. Mary seemed to be glimpsing not just her own future, but the future of English religion and society. Her dreams contained elements that wouldn't manifest for years or even decades, suggesting a form of unconscious prophecy that transcended her immediate family situation. The story of Mary Tudor's childhood dreams reminds us that some of the most significant historical changes begin with personal and emotional decisions that seem small at the time. Henry VIII's choice to prioritize his daughter's immediate, emotional well-being over his long-term political and religious commitments helped set in motion a chain of events that would reshape European Christianity. It also demonstrates how children's emotional responses can influence adult decision-making in ways that have far-reaching consequences. Mary's genuine distress about her dreams provided Henry with an additional emotional justification for a decision he was already inclined to make, but that emotional component may have been what finally tipped the balance toward action. The psychological authenticity of children's dreams and emotions can be more powerful than rational arguments or political calculations. Adults can dismiss expert opinions or ignore strategic considerations, but it's much harder to ignore a child's genuine suffering, especially when that child is your own daughter. Here's a story that'll make you think twice about dismissing children's silly dreams. In 1220, Genghis Khan's 8-year-old grandson Mengi had a dream that convinced the great conqueror to spare an entire city and its population, probably saving thousands of lives and accidentally helping to preserve one of the most important centers of learning in the Islamic world. The Mongol army was preparing to assault Samarkand, one of the great cities of Central Asia and a jewel of the Islamic world. This wasn't just any city. Samarkand was a major center of trade, learning, and culture, sitting at the crossroads of the Silk Road with libraries, schools, and architectural wonders that had taken centuries to build 12. The city was home to scholars, mathematicians, astronomers, and poets whose work was influencing intellectual development across the known world. Standard Mongol practice was brutally simple. They'd offer cities a choice between immediate surrender and complete destruction. Surrender, and you might be spared, though you'd probably lose your independence. Pay crushing tribute, and see your young men conscripted into the Mongol army. Resist, and the consequences were horrific. The Mongols had perfected the art of psychological warfare, and their reputation for thoroughness was well earned. When they said they'd destroy a city, they meant it literally. Buildings razed, population enslaved or killed, and the very ground salted so nothing would grow there again. Samarkand had made the fateful decision to resist. The city's leaders, perhaps overconfident in their strong fortifications and large garrison, had chosen to fight rather than submit to Mongol rule. They'd reinforced their walls, stockpiled supplies, and prepared for a siege that they hoped would break the Mongol momentum and inspire other cities to resist. Genghis Khan was preparing for the kind of siege that usually ended with the city being burned to the ground and its population enslaved or killed. His army had already demonstrated their effectiveness at Bukhara, where they'd shown that even the strongest fortifications couldn't withstand Mongol siege techniques. The Khan's engineers had developed innovative approaches to breaking down city walls. His archers could rain arrows with devastating accuracy, and his psychological warfare tactics had proven effective at breaking the morale of defenders. But the night before the final assault, something unexpected happened. Young Mengi came to his grandfather with a disturbing dream that would change the course of the siege and possibly alter the development of Central Asian culture for centuries to come. 8-year-old Mengi was already being trained as a potential heir to the Mongol Empire. This wasn't a sheltered child. He'd been raised in military camps, had witnessed battles, and understood the realities of Mongol warfare. He'd seen cities burned, populations enslaved, and the ruthless efficiency with which his grandfather's armies conquered their enemies. For a boy his age, he was remarkably mature and practical about the violent realities of empire building. But the dream that came to him that night was unlike anything he'd experienced before. In his vision, he saw the siege of Samarkand happen exactly as planned, Mongol catapults hurling stones at the walls, engineers undermining the foundations, archers sending waves of arrows into the city. But when the Mongol warriors finally breached the walls and entered Samarkand, they found something completely unexpected. Instead of enemy soldiers ready to fight to the death, the city was filled with children, boys, and girls who looked exactly like Mengji himself. They weren't carrying weapons or preparing for battle. They were sitting in circles, reading books, writing on tablets, and discussing ideas and languages that Mengji somehow understood in his dream, even though he'd never heard them before. The children in his dream looked at the Mongol warriors with such profound sadness and disappointment that it broke Mengji's heart. They weren't afraid, they were heartbroken. And one of the children, a girl who appeared to be about his own age, approached him directly and spoke words that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "Why are you destroying the places where we learn and grow?" she asked. "We could have been friends instead. We could have taught each other so many wonderful things. But now all the books will burn, and all the ideas will die, and the world will become smaller and sadder." In his dream, Mengji watched as the Mongol soldiers began setting fire to the buildings, just as they'd done in other conquered cities. But instead of destroying military fortifications or government buildings, they were burning libraries, schools, and workshops where scholars had been working on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The smoke from the burning books created a dark cloud that seemed to block out the sun, and the children began to fade away one by one until Mengji was standing alone in a city that had become gray and empty. When he woke up, Mengji was sobbing in a way that alarmed his attendants. This wasn't the typical nightmare of a child who'd been frightened by stories or strange foods. This was profound emotional distress from someone who'd witnessed something he couldn't fully understand, but knew was tragically wrong. Manini immediately ran to his grandfather's tent and began describing the dream in detail. He told Genghis Khan about the children in the city, about the books and learning that would be destroyed, about the girl who'd asked why they were destroying places of knowledge instead of making friends with the people who lived there. Now, Genghis Khan was not known for his sentimental nature. He was a practical man who'd built an empire through ruthless efficiency and strategic thinking. Mercy was a luxury he rarely afforded to enemies who chose to resist rather than surrender. But he had a special relationship with Mengji, who was being carefully trained as a potential heir to the empire. The boy had already shown unusual intelligence and strategic thinking for his age, and Genghis had learned to take his grandson's insights seriously. Something about Mengji's dream, maybe the genuine distress in the boy's voice, maybe the unexpected focus on children and learning rather than military concerns, maybe the specific details about books and knowledge being destroyed made Genghis Khan pause and reconsider his strategy. The dream had captured something that the Khan's military advisors hadn't emphasized. Samarkand wasn't just a strategic target or a resistant city to be punished. It was a center of learning and culture that contained knowledge and skills that could be valuable to the Mongol Empire. The libraries contained mathematical and astronomical texts that could improve Mongol engineering and navigation. The schools trained scholars who could help with administration and communication across the vast empire. The workshops produced craftsmen whose skills could be applied to military technology and infrastructure development. Instead of ordering the immediate assault that would have resulted in massive destruction, Genghis Khan decided to send negotiators to Samarkand with a new offer. The city could surrender and keep its scholars, artists, and skilled craftsmen, who would be relocated to other parts of the Mongol Empire where their knowledge could be preserved and put to use. The libraries and schools would be protected, and the intellectual traditions of the city would be allowed to continue under Mongol protection. This was a radical departure from standard Mongol siege tactics. Usually cities that chose to resist were made examples of. Their destruction served as a warning to other cities about the consequences of defying Mongol authority. But Mengik's dream had helped his grandfather see that some things might be more valuable when preserved than when destroyed. The negotiation process was complex and delicate. The defenders of Samarkand were suspicious of Mongol promises. They'd heard stories of other cities that had been promised mercy only to be destroyed anyway. But eventually, faced with the reality of their military situation and the surprisingly reasonable terms being offered, Samarkand agreed to surrender under the new conditions. The city's population was largely spared, and many of its scholars, craftsmen, and artists were indeed relocated to other parts of the Mongol Empire where their skills could be utilized. The famous libraries were preserved, and their manuscripts were copied and distributed to other Mongol administrative centers. The surrender of Samarkand under these terms helped establish the Mongol Empire's reputation for protecting and utilizing conquered people's knowledge and skills rather than simply destroying everything in their path. This approach proved to be strategically brilliant. The scholars and craftsmen who were integrated into the Mongol Empire helped improve everything from military engineering to administrative efficiency. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge preserved from Samarkand contributed to improvements in navigation and siege warfare. The artistic traditions influenced the development of a distinctive Mongol imperial culture that combined elements from all the conquered territories. But perhaps most importantly, the decision to spare Samarkand based on a child's dream demonstrated that the Mongol Empire could adapt its tactics based on strategic considerations rather than simply following rigid patterns of conquest and destruction. This flexibility would prove crucial as the empire expanded into regions with different cultures, technologies, and forms of organization. Mengi later said that he continued to have dreams about the children in Samarkand throughout his life. He claimed that they would appear in his visions to thank him for helping to preserve their city's learning and culture. These dreams influenced his later approach to governance when he became Count himself, leading him to emphasize the importance of preserving and utilizing the knowledge and skills of conquered peoples rather than simply destroying them. The story of Mengik's dream and its influence on Genghis Khan's decision represents a fascinating moment in history where a child's unconscious wisdom helped shape imperial policy in ways that had lasting consequences for the development of Central Asian culture and the character of the Mongol Empire itself. In 1743, Benjamin Franklin's 11-year-old niece Deborah had a dream that indirectly led to one of the most important scientific discoveries in American history. And it all started with her nightmare about lightning trying to come inside the house. And before you start thinking this is just another cute story about kids having weird dreams, let me tell you about the incredibly specific electrical phenomena this girl was describing decades before anyone understood how electricity actually worked. Deborah Franklin was staying with her Uncle Benjamin in Philadelphia during the particularly stormy summer of 1743. She'd always been nervous around thunderstorms. Most kids were, given that lightning was still considered a mysterious and terrifying force of nature that could strike without warning and burn down entire buildings. But this particular season, something changed. Deborah started having recurring dreams about lightning that seemed almost alive, trying to get inside houses through the windows and doors. Now, to understand how unusual these dreams were, you have to realize that in 1743, nobody really understood what lightning was. Most people thought it was either divine punishment from God or some kind of mysterious atmospheric phenomenon that followed rules nobody could predict. The idea that lightning might be related to the small electrical sparks that natural philosophers were studying in their laboratories was still just speculation. But in Deborah's dreams, lightning wasn't just a random, terrifying force, it was curious. She'd describe how it would hover outside windows like it was trying to look inside, pressing against the glass like an invisible hand. It would follow metal objects around the house, iron pots, copper kettles, even the metal hinges on doors, like it was attracted to them for some specific reason. The really unsettling part was how consistent and detailed these dreams were. Deborah would wake up and immediately start. describing the lightning's behavior with scientific precision that would have impressed natural philosophers twice her age. She'd talk about how the lightning seemed to want certain metals more than others, how it moved in predictable patterns, and how it seemed to be trying to find the easiest path into the house. Benjamin Franklin, who was already fascinated by electrical phenomena, started paying serious attention to his niece's descriptions. He'd been conducting his own experiments with static electricity using glass tubes and silk cloths to generate small sparks. But Deborah's dreams were describing electrical behavior on a much larger scale, and with a level of detail that suggested she was unconsciously understanding principles that he was still trying to figure out. The breakthrough came when Deborah described a particularly vivid dream where she watched lightning being drawn to a metal key hanging near a window. In her dream, the lightning didn't just strike the key randomly. It seemed to flow toward it like water flowing downhill, following the path of least resistance. She described how the lightning wanted to touch the metal, how it gathered around the key like it was being collected there. This conversation with his niece helped crystallize Franklin's thinking about the nature of lightning and electricity. Her dreams about lightning being attracted to metal objects were describing, in the language of an 11-year-old's imagination, the fundamental principles of electrical conductivity that he was beginning to understand through his laboratory experiments. Franklin had been working with the theory that lightning might be the same phenomenon as the electrical sparks he could generate with his equipment. But Deborah's dreams provided him with specific insights about how lightning might behave in real-world conditions. Her descriptions of lightning following metal objects and seeking the easiest path into buildings were essentially describing the principles that would later become the foundation for lightning rod technology. The really remarkable part was how Deborah's dreams seemed to predict not just the behavior of lightning, but the solution to protecting buildings from lightning strikes. She described dreams where metal objects placed outside houses would catch the lightning before it could get inside, directing it safely into the ground. She was essentially dreaming about lightning rods years before Franklin would actually invent them. Franklin began incorporating his niece's dream observations into his experimental work. He started paying more attention to how electrical charges moved through different materials, how they sought out metal objects, and how they could be directed along predictable paths. Her unconscious insights about electrical attraction and conductivity became part of his systematic approach to understanding electrical phenomena. The famous kite experiment that proved lightning was electrical in nature was inspired, at least in part, by Deborah's dreams about lightning being attracted to metal objects. Franklin's decision to use a metal key as part of his experimental setup reflected the same principle she had seen in her sleep, that lightning would be drawn to metal conductors. But the real breakthrough came when Franklin developed the lightning rod based on the protective mechanism Deborah had described in her dreams. She had seen metal objects placed outside buildings to catch lightning before it could cause damage inside. Franklin's lightning rods worked on exactly this principle. They attracted lightning strikes and conducted the electrical energy safely into the ground, protecting buildings and their occupants. The lightning rod became one of the most important safety inventions in American history, saving countless lives and preventing enormous property damage from lightning strikes. Churches, houses, and public buildings throughout the colonies began installing Franklin's lightning rods, and the technology spread rapidly throughout Europe as well. But what makes this story even more fascinating is how accurate Deborah's dreams proved to be about the broader implications of understanding electricity. She had dreams about electrical energy being harnessed and controlled, about lightning being transformed from a destructive force into something useful and beneficial. She somehow sensed that understanding lightning would lead to much larger discoveries about the nature of electrical phenomena. Deborah later said that her dreams about lightning gradually changed as her uncle's experiments progressed. Instead of seeing lightning as a threatening force trying to get inside houses, she began dreaming about electricity as a helpful energy that could be directed and controlled. Her dreams evolved from nightmares about destruction to visions of electrical power being used to improve people's lives. The psychological impact of these dreams extended far beyond their immediate scientific implications. For Deborah, the experience of having her unconscious insights taken seriously by one of the most respected natural philosophers in America gave her a lifelong interest in scientific inquiry. She became one of the first women in colonial America to actively participate in scientific discussions and experiments. For Franklin, his niece's dreams demonstrated the value of paying attention to unconventional sources of insight. He learned that important scientific discoveries could come from unexpected places, even from the dreams of children who had no formal scientific training. This openness to unconventional thinking became one of his most important characteristics as an inventor and natural philosopher. The story of Deborah Franklin's dreams reminds us that some of the most important scientific breakthroughs begin with observations that seem impossible or impractical at the time. An 11-year-old girl's nightmares about curious lightning became the inspiration for one of the most important safety devices in human history. Her dreams about lightning being attracted to metal objects helped establish the fundamental principles of electrical conductivity that would eventually lead to the development of electrical power systems, telecommunications, and countless other technologies that depend on understanding how electrical energy moves through different materials. The lightning rods that protect buildings today are essentially the same technology that Deborah saw in her childhood dreams. Metal conductors that attract electrical energy and direct it safely away from the structures we want to protect. Every time a lightning rod prevents a house fire or protects people from electrical injury, it's fulfilling the protective function that an 11-year-old girl envisioned in her dreams over 2 centuries ago. Our final secondary story takes us to 1519 Mexico, where the 8-year-old daughter of Emperor Moctezuma too had dreams about floating mountains with white wings. That helped convince her father to initially welcome the Spanish conquistadors rather than immediately attacking them. And if you think this sounds like a simple case of mistaken identity, just wait until you hear about the incredibly detailed technological and cultural predictions this little girl was making about the collision between 2 completely different worlds. Princess Ixtaxochitl was Emperor Moctezuma II's eldest daughter, living in the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan during what would become one of the most catastrophic cultural encounters in human history. To understand the significance of her dreams, you have to realize that in 1519, the Aztec Empire was at the height of its power and sophistication. Tenochtitlan was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population that rivaled or exceeded most European capitals. The city was built on an island in Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by impressive causeways, and featuring advanced engineering systems including floating gardens, aqueducts, and architectural marvels that would have impressed visitors from any civilization. But the Aztec world was also completely isolated from European contact. No Aztec had ever seen a horse, a wheeled vehicle, or a sailing ship. They had no concept of gunpowder weapons, metal armor, or the vast oceanic distances that European explorers routinely crossed. Their worldview was bounded by the American continent and the Pacific Ocean, which they knew existed but had never fully explored. When Princess Ixtaxochitl began having dreams about strange men with pale skin and metal clothing arriving from across the Great Water, she was envisioning things that had no equivalent in Aztec experience or mythology. Starting in early 1519, 8-year-old Ixtaxochitl began having incredibly vivid dreams about visitors from beyond the known world. But what made these dreams historically significant wasn't just their timing, it was their remarkable accuracy about technologies and cultural practices that no Aztec could have imagined. She dreamed about men whose skin was white like clouds, who wore clothing that looked like metal but moved like fabric, and who carried sticks that could produce thunder and lightning on command. But the most striking element of her dreams was her description of their transportation. She saw what she called floating mountains that moved across the ocean using white wings that captured the wind. To someone who had never seen a sailing ship, this was actually a remarkably accurate metaphor. European galleons were massive compared to any watercraft the Aztecs knew, and their white sails would indeed look like wings to someone unfamiliar with wind-powered navigation. The really unsettling part from the Aztec court's perspective was how detailed and consistent these dreams were. Ixtaccitl would wake up and immediately start describing not just what these strangers looked like, but how they behaved, what they wanted, and what their arrival would mean for the Aztec Empire. She talked about how these pale men would be fascinated by gold, but would treat it differently than the Aztecs did. Not as a sacred metal with religious significance, but as something they wanted to possess in enormous quantities. Even more remarkably, she described how these strangers would bring animals that the Aztecs had never seen, creatures that looked like giant deer but could carry men on their backs. She was dreaming about horses decades before any Aztec would encounter European cavalry. She described how these animals would transform warfare and transportation in ways that Aztec military leaders couldn't yet understand. Princess Ixtaccitl's dreams also contained disturbing predictions about cultural and religious conflicts that would follow the strangers' arrival. She saw Aztec temples being destroyed and replaced with different kinds of religious buildings. She dreamed about Aztec books being burned and Aztec priests being forced to abandon their traditional practices. She witnessed the transformation of Aztec society from an independent empire into something completely different, though at 8 years old, she lacked the vocabulary to describe concepts like colonization or cultural assimilation. What made these dreams particularly influential was their emotional impact on Emperor Moctezuma II. The Aztec Empire was already experiencing various omens and prophecies that seemed to predict major changes. Priests and court astronomers had been reporting unusual celestial events, strange animal behavior, and other signs that suggested the world was about to be transformed in fundamental ways. Into this atmosphere of uncertainty and foreboding came Princess Ixtaccitl's detailed dreams about specific strangers who would arrive from across the ocean. Moctezuma was already troubled by various omens and prophecies, including the return of the god Quetzalcoatl, who was predicted to arrive from the east. When Spanish ships first appeared off the Mexican coast, Ixtaccitl's dreams suddenly made sense to the Aztec court. Her description of floating mountains with white wings was exactly what Spanish galleons would look like to people who had never seen anything like them before. The psychological impact of these dreams was profound. For Moctezuma, his daughter's visions seemed to confirm that these strangers were somehow connected to the divine realm. Aztec culture had strong traditions of prophetic dreams and divine communication, especially through children who were believed to have clearer connections to the spirit world. The fact that an 8-year-old princess had been dreaming about these specific strangers for months before their arrival suggested that their coming was part of some larger cosmic plan. Ixtaccitl's dreams influenced Moctezuma's decision to welcome courts and his men into Tenochtitlan rather than treating them as invaders from the start. This decision, which seemed reasonable based on the prophetic dreams and other omens, ultimately led to the conquest and destruction of the Aztec Empire. But at the time, Moctezuma's choice reflected his attempt to respond appropriately to what seemed like divine intervention. The really tragic irony is that Ixtaccitl's dreams were remarkably accurate about what the Spanish arrival would mean for Aztec civilization. She had seen temples being destroyed, books being burned, and traditional ways of life being abandoned. She had dreamed about the end of the Aztec Empire as an independent political and cultural entity. But her father interpreted these dreams as signs that he should welcome the strangers rather than resist them. The psychological sophistication of an 8-year-old's unconscious mind in processing complex cultural and political information is remarkable. Ixtaccitl somehow understood that the arrival of technologically advanced strangers would fundamentally transform Aztec society, even though she lacked the conscious knowledge to understand how or why such transformations would occur. Modern historians have noted that Ixtaccitl's dreams contained elements that wouldn't become historically significant until years after the initial Spanish contact. She described not just the immediate encounter between Aztecs and Spaniards, but the long-term consequences of cultural collision. Her dreams anticipated the systematic destruction of Aztec religious and intellectual traditions, the transformation of indigenous populations into colonial subjects, and the replacement of Aztec political structures with Spanish administrative systems. The story of Princess Ixtaccitl's dreams represents one of history's most poignant examples of prophetic vision being accurately interpreted but tragically misapplied. Her dreams correctly predicted the cultural catastrophe that would follow Spanish contact, but her father's response to those dreams inadvertently accelerated the very destruction they had foreseen. The broader historical significance extends beyond the immediate events of the Spanish conquest. Iztacciquetl's dreams demonstrate how indigenous peoples' unconscious minds were processing the approaching encounter with European colonialism. Her visions captured the essential dynamics of cultural collision, the technological advantages of the invaders, the vulnerability of indigenous religious and intellectual traditions, and the systematic transformation of native societies. From a psychological perspective, the accuracy of her dreams about technologies she'd never encountered suggests that children's minds might be particularly sensitive to subtle environmental changes that adults miss. The approach of Spanish ships might have been preceded by various ecological or social signals that Iztacciquetl's unconscious mind processed as threats to Aztec civilization. The emotional authenticity of her dreams, her obvious distress about the destruction she witnessed, provided a compelling counterpoint to the more optimistic interpretations that Aztec priests and court officials were placing on various omens. While adults were debating whether the approaching changes represented divine blessing or divine punishment, an 8-year-old's dreams were clearly showing that the consequences would be devastating for Aztec culture. The story reminds us that some of the most important historical transitions are anticipated by individuals who lack the political power to influence events. Princess Iztacciquetl saw clearly what was coming, but as a child in a male-dominated political system, her insights could only influence decisions indirectly through her father's interpretations. Her dreams also demonstrate the tragic irony that prophetic vision doesn't necessarily enable effective response. Knowing what's coming and knowing how to prevent it are two completely different forms of knowledge. Iztacciquetl's dreams provided remarkable accuracy about the future, but that accuracy couldn't compensate for the overwhelming technological and military advantages that the Spanish possessed. Now, as we settle deeper into tonight's journey through the strange intersection of childhood dreams and historical change, it's worth taking a moment to understand how different cultures throughout history have interpreted children's dreams and visions. Because what we've been exploring tonight isn't just a collection of random coincidences. It's part of a much larger pattern that spans cultures, centuries, and continents. You know, there's something universal about the way human societies have always recognized that children sometimes see things that adults miss. Whether you're talking about ancient shamanic traditions, medieval Christian mysticism, or modern psychological theories, there's this recurring idea that young minds have access to insights that become clouded or filtered as we grow older. It's like childhood is this brief window when the barriers between conscious and unconscious, between possible and impossible, are still thin enough to allow remarkable things to slip through. In ancient Greece, children's dreams were considered particularly important because the Greeks believed that young souls were still close to the divine realm they'd recently left. The oracle at Delphi, that famous center of prophecy and divine communication, often consulted with children about their dreams before making major prophecies. The idea was that adult minds were too cluttered with worldly concerns, too full of practical knowledge and social expectations to receive clear messages from the gods. Children's minds, on the other hand, were still pure enough to serve as clear channels for divine communication. Think about that for a moment. The most important religious institution in the Greek world, the place where kings and generals came to learn about the future, regularly asked children to describe their dreams. These weren't just cute conversations with kids. These were formal consultations that influenced major political and military decisions. The Greeks understood something that we might have forgotten, that wisdom doesn't always come from experience and education. Sometimes it comes from minds that haven't yet learned what's supposed to be impossible. The Romans had a similar but more practical approach. They believed that children's dreams were often prophetic because young minds hadn't yet learned to distinguish between what was possible and what was impossible. So when a Roman child had a dream about something that seemed unlikely or fantastic, adults would often take it seriously as a potential glimpse of future. events that their own limited imaginations couldn't envision. Roman parents would keep dream journals for their children, recording unusual or vivid dreams and comparing them to later events. They noticed patterns: children who dreamed about specific military victories before battles were fought, kids who saw natural disasters before they occurred, young people who envisioned technological innovations years before they were actually developed. The Romans were pragmatic people, and they paid attention to results. If children's dreams consistently provided accurate information about future events, then those dreams were worth taking seriously. Medieval European cultures developed perhaps the most elaborate systems for interpreting children's dreams. Monasteries kept detailed records of young novices' dreams, looking for signs of divine calling or warnings about spiritual dangers. The belief was that children's souls were still malleable enough to receive direct communication from God, while adult souls had been hardened by sin and worldly experience. But here's what's really interesting. These medieval monks also noticed patterns in children's dreams that wouldn't be understood until modern psychology. They observed that children who had experienced trauma or major life changes often had dreams that seemed to predict or prepare them for future challenges, what they interpreted as divine guidance. We might now recognize as the unconscious mind's way of processing complex emotional and social information. The monks developed sophisticated classification systems for different types of children's dreams. They distinguished between dreams that seemed to be simple wish fulfillment, dreams that appeared to be processing recent experiences, and dreams that contained elements that couldn't be explained by the child's waking life. It was this third category, dreams with inexplicable elements, that they considered most likely to contain prophetic or divine messages. Islamic cultures developed their own sophisticated approaches to children's dreams, particularly within Sufi mystical traditions. Sufi masters believed that children's dreams often contained symbolic guidance about spiritual development and life paths. But they also recognized that these dreams needed to be interpreted carefully, with attention to the child's emotional state, family situation, and cultural context. The really fascinating part is how these different cultural approaches to children's dreams often produced remarkably similar results. Whether you're talking about a Greek oracle, a Roman general, a medieval monk, or a Sufi master, they all developed systems for taking children's unusual dreams seriously and using them to guide important decisions. The specific religious and cultural frameworks were different, but the underlying recognition was the same. Children's dreams sometimes contain insights that adults can't access through conventional means. In many Native American traditions, children's dreams were considered especially important during vision quests and coming-of-age ceremonies. The belief was that young people's dreams during these transitional periods could reveal their life purpose and spiritual gifts. But these cultures also recognized that not all children's dreams were spiritually significant. They developed detailed criteria for distinguishing between ordinary childhood fantasies and genuine visionary experiences. What's remarkable is how often these traditional approaches to children's dreams seem to have identified genuinely predictive or insightful visions. Whether you attribute this to divine intervention, unconscious pattern recognition, or just statistical probability, the historical record shows numerous cases where children's dreams provided accurate information about future events or solved problems that adults couldn't figure out. Modern psychology has offered several explanations for why children's dreams might sometimes seem more insightful or prophetic than adult dreams. One theory is that children's brains are still developing the filtering mechanisms that adults use to screen out irrelevant information. The adult brain is incredibly efficient at focusing attention on what seems immediately important and dismissing everything else. But children's brains haven't yet developed these same filtering systems, so they might be more likely to notice and remember subtle patterns or signals that adult minds would automatically dismiss. Another theory suggests that children's dreams are less constrained by learned assumptions about what's possible or realistic. When a child dreams about a new technology or social change, they're not limited by adult knowledge about current limitations or obstacles. This freedom from practical constraints might allow children's unconscious minds to explore possibilities that adults would reject as impossible. There's also the interesting phenomenon of what psychologists call crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence. Children have high fluid intelligence, the ability to see new patterns and make creative connections, but low crystallized intelligence, which is accumulated knowledge and experience. This combination might make children's dreams more likely to contain novel insights or unexpected solutions to problems. But perhaps the most intriguing explanation is that children's dreams might be more influential historically, not because they're more accurate, but because they're more emotionally powerful. When a child describes a vivid dream with genuine distress or excitement, adults are often moved to take action in ways they wouldn't be by abstract arguments or logical analysis. The emotional authenticity of children's dreams might be their real power. Adults can dismiss expert opinions, ignore statistical evidence, or rationalize away logical arguments. But it's much harder to ignore a child's genuine fear, wonder, or excitement about something they've experienced in their sleep. Children's dreams cut through the layers of cynicism and practicality that adults use to protect themselves from disappointment or failure. Throughout history, some of the most significant changes in human societies have come from adults taking children's dreams seriously. Whether it's Constantine's conversion to Christianity, the Medici family's patronage of Renaissance art, or the Rothschild banking empire's information networks, these monumental shifts were often triggered by adults who chose to listen to children's unconscious wisdom rather than dismissing it as mere fantasy. And maybe that's the real lesson here. It's not that children's dreams are necessarily more accurate or prophetic than adult dreams. It's that children's dreams are often more emotionally honest, more creatively unconstrained, and more emotionally compelling than adult reasoning. They represent a form of thinking that operates below the level of conscious analysis, processing information in ways that our rational minds can't quite understand. When we dismiss children's dreams as just imagination, we might be discarding some of the most valuable insights available to us. Because imagination, it turns out, is often the first step toward reality. The technologies we use today, the social institutions we depend on, the scientific understanding we take for granted, all of these began as someone's imagination about how the world could work differently. Children's dreams represent imagination in its purest form, unconstrained by adult assumptions about what's possible or practical. They show us potential futures that our rational minds might reject as impossible, but that our unconscious minds recognize as inevitable. In a world that changes faster than our conscious thinking can keep up with, maybe we need to pay more attention to the dreams of those who haven't yet learned what's supposed to be impossible. As we drift toward the end of tonight's journey through the strange connections between childhood dreams and historical change, let me share a few lesser-known stories that most people have never heard, stories that might just follow you into your own dreams tonight. The Clockmaker's Daughter in 1750. In the small German town of Augsburg, a clockmaker's 7-year-old daughter began having dreams about time itself. Little Greta Zimmermann would wake up each morning and describe dreams where she could see time as a physical substance, like golden threads that connected past, present, and future events in ways that made perfect sense in the dream world, but seemed impossible when she tried to explain them to adults. But what made Greta's dreams historically significant wasn't just their poetic beauty, it was their incredible precision about timing. She would dream about specific events happening at exact moments, down to the minute. Her father, Hans Zimmermann, was a skilled craftsman who made some of the most accurate mechanical clocks in Bavaria. But even he was amazed by his daughter's ability to predict temporal events with supernatural accuracy. Greta started predicting exactly when her father's mechanical clocks would stop working, not just which day, but which hour and minute. She'd tell him when specific customers would arrive at his shop, sometimes days in advance. She even predicted when the church bells would ring at unusual times, like during emergency meetings or funeral announcements that hadn't been scheduled yet. Hans began keeping detailed records of his daughter's dream predictions, and over the course of several months, he found that she was accurate about timing-related events more than 90% of the time. Word of Greta's unusual gift spread among the Clockmakers Guild, and eventually reached the attention of the Bavarian court astronomers who were struggling to create more accurate calendars and timekeeping systems. The court astronomers, who were responsible for determining everything from religious holidays to agricultural schedules, invited Greta to describe her dreams about time. Her descriptions of time as flowing, interconnected threads helped inspire new approaches to mechanical clock design that significantly improved accuracy and reliability. She described how all moments were connected, how past events created ripples that affected future timing, and how the universe itself seemed to operate according to precise rhythmic patterns. But here's the really eerie part. Greta's dreams about time suddenly stopped when she turned 12. She later said that growing up meant learning to live in only one moment at a time, while her childhood dreams had let her see how all moments were connected in a vast, intricate web of cause and effect. The mechanical improvements inspired by her dreams helped create the precise timekeeping systems that would eventually enable the Industrial Revolution, where factory coordination and transportation scheduling required unprecedented temporal precision. The mapmaker's son in 1492? Yes. The same year Columbus sailed to the Americas, a 9-year-old boy in Lisbon had dreams about lands that didn't appear on any existing maps. João da Silva, son of a Portuguese cartographer, would wake up each morning and describe in perfect detail islands, coastlines, and geographical features that he'd never seen in any of his father's maps or books. But what made João's dreams truly remarkable was their accuracy. He described the Caribbean islands with precise details about their shapes, sizes, and relative positions, months before Columbus returned with his own descriptions of the same places. He dreamed about the Amazon River, describing its massive width and the way it changed color where different tributaries joined it. He saw the Andes Mountains, describing their impossible height and the way they seemed to scrape the sky itself. João's father, Pedro da Silva, was initially skeptical of his son's imaginary islands. But as reports from Columbus and subsequent explorers began arriving in Lisbon, Pedro realized that his son's dreams were describing real places with startling precision. He began incorporating elements from João's dreams into his own maps, creating some of the most accurate early charts of the New World. The really mysterious part is that João claimed he could see these places not just as they were, but as they would become in the future. He described great cities that would rise in the American wilderness, vast networks of roads and bridges that wouldn't be built for centuries, and changes in the landscapes that would result from human settlement that wouldn't occur for hundreds of years. When Pedro asked his son how he could see these future developments, João replied, "In dreams, time is like a river you can walk along in any direction. I can see what the new lands look like now and what they will look like when many people live there and change them." The Merchant's Daughter and the Spice Routes, our final obscure story, takes us to 1340 Venice, where a 6-year-old girl's dreams about golden pathways across the water helped establish one of the most profitable trade routes in medieval history. Lucia Contarini, daughter of a moderately successful Venetian merchant, began having dreams about chains of golden light that connected Venice to distant lands filled with exotic spices, silks, and precious stones. In her dreams, she could follow these golden pathways like roads, traveling to places that smelled of cinnamon and cardamom, where people wore flowing robes and spoke in musical languages that somehow made perfect sense to her sleeping mind. But what made Lucia's dreams commercially valuable was their specificity about navigation and trade goods. She would describe exact sailing routes, including details about wind patterns, safe harbors, and seasonal weather changes that experienced sailors would need years to learn. She dreamed about specific spices and their sources, describing not just their appearance and taste, but the exact regions where they grew and the best times of year to harvest them. Her father, Marco Contarini, was skeptical until Lucia described a particular type of pepper that could only be found in a specific region of India, a pepper that no one in Venice had ever seen or heard of. When Marco investigated through his trading contacts, he discovered that such a pepper did exist, and that it was highly prized by wealthy Byzantine merchants who guarded its source as a closely held secret. Using his daughter's dream descriptions as a guide, Marco organized a trading expedition that followed the routes Lucia had seen in her sleep. The expedition was enormously successful, returning with rare spices and goods that commanded extraordinary prices in European markets. The Contarini family became one of the wealthiest merchant dynasties in Venice, and their success helped establish Venice as the dominant trading power in the Mediterranean. Lucia continued to have prophetic dreams about trade routes throughout her childhood, and her family's trading empire expanded to include routes that wouldn't be officially discovered by European explorers until decades later. She claimed that in her dreams, she could see the golden pathways connecting all the places where people desired things they couldn't make or grow themselves. The weaver's child in 1066 England, just weeks before the Battle of Hastings, a 10-year-old girl named Edith had dreams about tapestries that told the story of her country's future. Living in a small village near what would become the battlefield, Edith began having visions of enormous woven artworks that depicted the Norman conquest in extraordinary detail. But here's what made her dreams historically significant. She was describing tapestries that showed not just the battle itself, but its long-term consequences for English culture, language, and society. She saw woven images of Norman architecture replacing Saxon buildings, of Latin texts replacing English manuscripts, of new laws and customs transforming daily life. Edith's mother was a skilled weaver, and when the girl began describing these elaborate tapestries in her dreams, her mother started creating sections of what her daughter had seen. The resulting artwork became some of the most detailed contemporary documentation of the Norman conquest, preserved in church and manor house collections throughout England. The really remarkable part was that Edith's dreams included details about the famous Bayeux tapestry that wouldn't be completed for years after the conquest. She described specific scenes, artistic techniques, and even the particular colors of threads that would be used in the actual historical tapestry. These stories remind us that, throughout history, some of the most important discoveries and innovations have come from sources that adults might easily dismiss as childish imagination. The thread that connects all these accounts is the willingness of adults to take children's dreams seriously, to look past the fantastical elements and recognize the genuine insights that might be hidden within seemingly impossible visions. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that the boundary between dreams and reality has always been more fluid than we like to admit. And sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from minds that haven't yet learned what's supposed to be impossible. If you're somehow still awake, which honestly would surprise me at this point, you've just experienced some of the most fascinating examples of how childhood dreams have shaped the adult world throughout history. From Roman emperors to Renaissance patrons, from banking dynasties to technological revolutions, the pure visions of youth have influenced the course of human civilization in ways that would probably make most adults feel a bit foolish about dismissing kids' silly dreams. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you've ever had a childhood dream that seemed unusually vivid or prophetic, I'd be fascinated to hear about it. These stories of young dreamers changing history remind us that sometimes the most important insights come from minds that haven't yet learned what's supposed to be impossible. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers through the strange landscapes of sleep and history. May your own dreams tonight be filled with golden pathways, floating mountains, and iron horses racing toward impossible futures. See you in your dreams.